Thank you so much to the Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation for having me here today. It's really an honor to speak at this event. I think I'm super excited. This is the first time I've had a chance to speak at an event geared towards patients and caregivers. And I think the number of you who are here today is just wonderful to see, and it speaks to the fact that this disease is rising both in incidence and prevalence, and so advancing our therapies is so very, very important as we make our way towards hopefully curing this cancer in the future. And so like Ms. Gellerman mentioned, I am one of the medical oncologists at Sloan Kettering, and so my practice is primarily devoted to neuroendocrine tumors, but I do see a few other types of GI cancers, and I'm going to be speaking with you guys today about how to understand clinical trials, which is very essential to my practice as an academic medical oncologist. So my agenda is threefold today, and so I want to spend the first portion of the talk really just giving you some pearls about neuroendocrine tumors. Some of this has already been discussed today, but just to re-emphasize that in the context of how we develop clinical trials, what you guys as patients should maybe be thinking about with regards to your specific subtype of disease when you're thinking about perhaps enrolling in a clinical trial. I'm then going to kind of step back, and we're going to talk about the fundamentals of clinical trials. So just some basic understanding of the principles behind clinical trial development, enrollment of patients on studies, and what the purpose is of the studies that we develop. And then we'll spend the last few minutes discussing the landscape currently for the clinical trials in neuroendocrine tumors on the horizon. Not so much to go into the details of these studies, but to help you all understand what we're thinking about as researchers and where we sort of see the next several years headed in terms of our discoveries. So first, just to focus in on some pearls about neuroendocrine tumors that we, as the treatment team, think about when we're developing these studies, but also you as a patient should think about when you're considering a clinical trial. And so my first slide here, I know this has been spoken about a few times today, but it's just to really emphasize again, location, location, location. And so yes, for some neuroendocrine tumors, we are not able to identify the site of origin of the disease, but for many neuroendocrine tumors, we are able to figure out where the cancer started. And that is incredibly important when we, as the treatment team, are thinking about what's the right therapy for you to initiate, when to initiate therapy, and when to think about a clinical trial. And so very broadly speaking, we divide the origin of neuroendocrine tumors into three categories. So there's foregut neuroendocrine tumors, midgut neuroendocrine tumors, and hindgut neuroendocrine tumors. The foregut ones primarily comprise of those that start in the pancreas, but we also think about thymic, esophagus, lung, stomach, and duodenal neuroendocrine tumors as foregut cancers. The midgut neuroendocrine tumors are most commonly our small bowel neuroendocrine tumors. Those most commonly start in the terminal ileum, but also include cancers that originate in the appendix and in the right side of the colon. And then finally, the hindgut neuroendocrine tumors most commonly start in the rectum, but also include the left side of the colon. So whenever you're thinking about a clinical trial in neuroendocrine tumors, you're often going to see that we're either focusing on the spectrum, so a neuroendocrine tumor that originated anywhere, or we're subdividing and we're looking specifically perhaps at foregut, midgut, or hindgut neuroendocrine tumors, or a combination of these subtypes. Now, the next pearl when it comes to neuroendocrine tumors and thinking about clinical trials is pathology. And I know that a few of the talks previously have spoken about this, but I'm going to re-emphasize it because I think this is just so important for both the patient to understand, but also the provider to think very thoughtfully about when thinking about studies and therapies. And so the classification by the pathologist is our strongest prognostic tool as clinicians. And so whenever I meet a patient in my clinic who has a new diagnosis of a neuroendocrine tumor, we spend a bulk of that first visit talking about the pathologic classification of their tumor. And so to kind of break it down for you, what I talk to my patients about is neuroendocrine tumors comprise a variety of diseases within the name. And so we have this huge spectrum here. And we look at two aspects when we're thinking about the pathology. The first aspect is the differentiation of the tumor. That is, how healthy appearing do those cells look under the microscope. You have the well-differentiated or the relatively healthy appearing cells, and you have the poorly differentiated or kind of more angry-looking cells under the microscope. The second aspect is how quickly are those cells dividing. And so there's this spectrum in terms of tumor grade, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, that speaks to the rate of cell division. And so when we think about this spectrum of disease biology, on one end you have your well-differentiated and your low-grade neuroendocrine tumors. And then all the way at the other end you have your poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinomas. And then there's this spectrum of biology along this spectrum. And so when we're thinking about a clinical trial or a treatment, we have to think about that spectrum. And so what you'll see is some of the studies are focusing in just on the well-differentiated tumors or the poorly differentiated tumors, or perhaps a smattering, so they're combining low and intermediate grade, or they're just looking at the poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinomas. So that is incredibly important when we're thinking about a study for treating your disease, but also for you to understand as the patient, because that comes into our thought process when we're just even thinking about standard therapies to begin with. Understanding that so many of these neuroendocrine tumors can grow very, very slowly over time. When we as physicians enter medical school, we take the Hippocratic Oath, which is first to do no harm. And so it's very, very important that we don't take credit for good biology. So understanding that these well-differentiated low-grade tumors, those at this end of the spectrum, can grow very, very slowly over many years, we have to think thoughtfully about when's the right time to start treatment and when's the right time to think about a clinical trial. And so most commonly, when we're thinking about starting treatment, or we might be talking to you about a study, is in three instances. Either you're starting to have some symptoms related to the cancer itself, you have symptoms because your cancer is secreting hormones. There was a talk earlier today about functional or hormone-secreting neuroendocrine tumors. Or we've been watching your cancer for a period of time, and yes, now it's starting to grow, and we think this is the right time to start therapy. So I included this slide here not so much to go into the details about these clinical trials, but this slide outlines the advances in therapy for neuroendocrine tumors since the 1980s. And what you can see is that really since 2010 is when we've had a slew of developments in terms of treatments for the disease. And all of these drugs were approved through data from large randomized phase 3 clinical trials. And I'll explain to you more what a phase 3 trial is. But it's very, very exciting. It's a wonderful time to be a medical oncologist taking care of patients with this disease. But it's incredibly important for all of us to understand that it's through clinical trials that we have made these developments. So as had been mentioned, I take care of patients with other types of GI cancers as well. It's a smaller part of my practice, including colorectal and pancreas cancer. And we have had the most developments when it comes to GI cancers in neuroendocrine tumors over the past decade. And this slide here just outlines in general terms the treatment landscape. So what we have right now, what's approved, what is readily available for us. And I included this slide not so much to go into the details, but to again emphasize that the location can be very, very important. And so just in very broad terms, we kind of divide those that start in the pancreas and often lump a lot of the foregut neuroendocrine tumors into one category versus those that start outside of the pancreas. So for this next portion here, I'm going to step back a little bit, and we're just going to talk about the fundamentals of clinical trials, things that I think is very important for you to think about as a patient and understand when you're thinking about studies, and things that it's very important to make sure that we as providers explain to you as well when we're talking about clinical trials. And so first and foremost, what is a clinical trial? So when I went online and looked up at the definition from the National Institutes of Health, they defined a clinical trial as a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. Now, when I read through this, this was very, very difficult for me to understand. And so I don't like the way that this is kind of explained. And so I think we need to break this down a little bit more. And this kind of speaks to a lot of the confusion people can have with clinical trials. Just our terminology can be very difficult for everyone to understand. So when we break it down, what do I think a clinical trial is? Well, I think clinical trials are research studies that are designed to answer questions about new ways to treat cancers. And I love the way our website at Memorial explains it in even simpler terms. Clinical trials are research studies that test new treatments to see how well they work. So clinical trials are going to study these new treatments and other ways to use currently available treatments, so things that are already approved for the disease or for other cancers. The purpose of clinical trials is to look at safety and tolerability, but to also look at efficacy. Very important for everyone to understand, a clinical trial requires approval from a governance called the Institutional Review Board, also known as an IRB, before a study is opened. So what an IRB does is an IRB meets, they review the protocol, which is something that we as investigators write and develop in collaboration with many people. They assess risks and benefits of a proposed study, and they ensure that for you as a patient, the risks are reduced and the potential benefits of a study are going to outweigh the risks. So as best as they can, they try to ensure that. Now, once an IRB approves a clinical trial and allows for it to be conducted, it's very important to remember that the approval of a study does not mean that the therapy that's being tested is safe or effective. That's the goal of the study. That's why we're doing the clinical trial. So what are the types of clinical trials that are available? So what any patient is going to be thinking about is either a phase 1, a phase 2, or a phase 3 clinical trial. Now, prior to any of these sorts of studies, we have what's called a preclinical study, and that's what happens back in the lab. And so it's from data in the lab, that's what initially generates that idea that perhaps this is something we should now bring over to humans. And so the first type of study is what we call a phase 1 clinical trial. This is a study that's really focused on determining what the safe dose is of an investigational drug for patients and is looking specifically at safety and side effects. These are small studies. They're about 15 to 25 patients. And usually the way these works are through what we call a 3x3 design. So what will happen is that we'll have one cohort of 3 patients, and let's say we start testing the drug at 15 milligrams. Everyone does okay on that, so then we bump it up to the next cohort. We study 20 milligrams in 3 patients. And then everyone does okay on that, so then we go up to 25 milligrams. And then let's say one patient at that 25 milligram dose has a lot of trouble. Okay, then we're going to expand that cohort. We're going to add 3 more patients in and see how those people do. Now, if more people have trouble at that level, then we go back down. So you can imagine on a phase 1 study as a patient, you might be underdosed, you might be overdosed. The whole purpose of it is to try to figure out what's the safe dose in humans. And I think that's important for everyone to understand. If we're able to establish a safe dose and we think there's a role to study the drug further, then it'll move into the phase 2 setting. And that is the goal of a phase 2 study is really to look at efficacy. So is the drug effective? Do we see some sort of activity in whatever disease we're studying? But again, in a phase 2 study, you're getting more safety data as well. These studies are usually a little bit larger. There's about 25 to 50 patients in these sorts of studies. And then finally, if a phase 2 study is very promising, you see efficacy, you're going to move to a phase 3 study. These are big studies. They compare this new treatment to a standard or an approved treatment. And so the goal of a phase 3 study is to confirm the effectiveness of a new therapy and provide additional safety data. These are very large studies, hundreds of patients, usually multi-center international studies. So all those, when I showed you that slide earlier of all those studies, those were all large phase 3 studies. Traditionally, in order for a drug to gain FDA approval, you would need to have a phase 3 study, and then the drug would be approved by the FDA. That's still generally what happens, but I included the arrow at the bottom to just acknowledge that in some settings, very promising data from a phase 2 study, especially in rare diseases, can lead to FDA approval. So more and more we are seeing that there are phase 2 studies from which the data generated will lead to FDA approval. So when to consider a clinical trial? And I would argue that clinical trials should be considered throughout an individual's treatment course for cancer or another health condition. It should be an ongoing discussion with your oncologist, and I think in particular it's very valuable to discuss clinical trials with your treatment team when you're at a decision point. So when there's a plan to either initiate therapy or when you're going to have a switch in your cancer treatment, this is a great time to sit down with your team and say, hey, are there any clinical trials that you think make sense for me, or what's happening? Can we talk about them? So how do clinical trials work? So the first step is something called informed consent, and this is very, very, very important. And so what informed consent is let's say we've established, there might be a good study that we think you might be eligible for. Well, then we really need to sit down and speak with you about the risks and benefits, the rationale behind the study, why we're doing it, why we think it might be good for you, compare it to what's currently available that we could offer you off of a study. And ultimately, if you as a patient think it makes sense, you will actually give your permission to participate. And I think I really want to emphasize that agreeing to be on a clinical trial is completely voluntary and completely non-binding. So at any point, you can always come off the study. Once you've given informed consent to go on a study, you go into the screening process, and this is when we look at what we call inclusion and exclusion criteria. These are criteria that are clearly outlined in a study protocol that will determine if, yes, you can participate in a study. So those first few slides when I was talking about the location of the tumor, the pathology, those are often built into the inclusion and the exclusion criteria for trials in neuroendocrine tumors. And it'll also take into consideration your health. Do you have any other medical issues? What therapies have you been on in the past? What is your age? Do you have any liver, kidney issues? Are your blood counts abnormal? And it's all with the goal of optimizing safety. So we want to first and foremost make sure this is an appropriate treatment and it's safe for you to take, at least from everything that we know about the investigational drug. Now, after we go through the screening process, if everything checks out okay, then we start treatment on the study. And you're monitored very closely throughout a study to evaluate for any side effects and also for efficacy. And the things that we're typically looking at are endpoints such as response. So did the cancer shrink, stay stable? Did it grow while you were on the study? And then bigger endpoints specifically looking at survival. And that's usually collected over a period of many years. So what are the pros of clinical trials? So if a new treatment is being offered on a study and is proven to work and you are receiving it, you may gain access before it is widely available. So you might be the first to access a novel therapy. A new treatment could be more effective than available standard options for the cancer. A clinical trial can increase the number of treatments that you have. And a clinical trial can offer the opportunity to help others and advance knowledge and future our cancer care. So perhaps not directly your care, but you may advance our understanding of the disease, hopefully helping others in the future. The cons of clinical trials. So there may be side effects or risks we do not expect. So we have some understanding of these drugs before we conduct the study, but we're learning. And so there could be things that come up that we weren't aware of before we started the study. There might be more frequent visits to the hospital or blood tests that are taken, and I think this is particularly important in phase 1 clinical trials. So whenever my patients are thinking about phase 1 studies, we spend a long time talking about the calendar and what it's going to mean in terms of quality of life, and I think that's something to be very thoughtful about, understanding what the purpose is of a phase 1 clinical trial. In randomized studies, you cannot choose whether you get the trial treatment or the standard treatment, so it's a coin flip as to what arm you end up on. A new treatment, even if it's beneficial for some people, may not work for you. And finally, a new treatment may not be better than available standard options. So discussing these sorts of studies with your physician, I think that it's very important to take the opportunity to review the informed consent for a proposed study in advance of the visit. So often when I speak with my patients about clinical trials and we talk about it possibly being something worth thinking about, I encourage people to take the informed consent home, read it over the weekend or spend a few days taking a look at it, and then we'll sit down again in a few days. We'll go through all of your questions. We'll again discuss the rationale, why we think it might be a good study before we decide, yes, I'm going to sign the informed consent and I'm going to go on the study, and I think that's very important. I think it's very helpful to have someone there with you to help you ask questions and help recall things you might not remember after the visit. Write down all of your questions and just don't hesitate to ask us questions. That is super duper important, and that's why we're here. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about what the current landscape is for clinical trials in neuroendocrine tumors. And the next few slides highlight a lot of the studies. Some of these are ongoing, some of these have closed recently. And I'm not going to go through each slide individually. I just put these slides up there so that you guys have an understanding of what we're thinking about as researchers now for the next few years moving forward in terms of what we think is very important in terms of advancing treatment for the disease. And so this first slide just selects a few studies that are focusing in on the somatostatin analogs. As Dr. Woolen mentioned, the SPINET study is now closed, but there are some ongoing efforts in somatostatin analogs and liver-directed therapy, and also in what we call targeted therapy. So those drugs that block specific signaling pathways that are thought to be in overdrive in some of these neuroendocrine tumors. And what's important also to see in this slide is all of these ones are phase 3 studies, and they're happening all over the world. So I'm not necessarily advocating that you go to Europe to do a study, but to have some understanding that there are studies happening everywhere, likely very near where you live too. Now, this next slide is just looking at immunotherapy, and this was just spoken about in the last session. And obviously, immunotherapy has been a tremendous breakthrough for a subset of cancers and solid tumors so far, and we're still learning if there's a role for these drugs in neuroendocrine tumors, and there's a lot that we still don't understand. So there's a lot of earlier clinical trials ongoing right now or have recently completed accrual that are trying to understand if there's a role for immunotherapy in this disease and perhaps at what part of that spectrum immunotherapy may work best. And the last two slides touch on PRRT, which is going to be talked about next. And I put these up there really to mention that with PRRT, we're looking at a variety of things. We're comparing it to some of our other therapies, so trying to understand sequencing of therapy in combination with chemotherapy, before and after surgery. We're also trying to improve on our understanding of dosing of PRRT to minimize toxicities to patients, and looking at more novel ways to use PRRT, so different modes of administration, not just IV, and also kind of what we call newer generation PRRT therapies. So this last slide is up here just to kind of really highlight the collaborative nature of research, especially for neuroendocrine tumors. So this is our entire team here at Sloan Kettering, and it comprises, I think, at all institutions of oncologists, surgeons, radiation doctors, nuclear medicine physicians, pathologists, endocrinologists, gastroenterologists. We're all a part of these clinical trials, and so we're all working together to advance therapy. And so I feel very fortunate to work with such a wonderful team, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have during the panel. Thank you.